So it's called Big Game Theory Hunting, the Peculiarities of Human Behavior in the InfoSec Game, which I understand is a little vague. If you don't know Marion, she's like an amazing reverse engineer and malware analyst. She's now working at Intel, actually. And she had a great talk called, I think it was Big Game Hunting, about like, I think it was like, again, reverse engineering malware. And so I wanted to riff off of that because it was a great presentation. So I'm Kelly. I'm a product manager in the InfoSec world. So I do the like strategizing and vision stuff related to building security products. I'm really trying to think about like what's the actual value that people need as a security practitioner rather than just like bolting on features. I spend most of my weekends and evenings looking at things like behavioral econ, lately looking at like cross-domain analysis from like climate change, looking at different models of resiliency to see how it applies to InfoSec. I think in general cross-domain research is super important. People don't do it enough, like not just in InfoSec, in every domain, but it turns out there are lots of smart people in lots of different areas, so it's good to learn from them. And this is game theory. So the talk is about game theory, but it's really going to be about behavioral game theory. But traditional game theory, like Game Theory 101, you see a lot of times, particularly on Twitter, people conducting these sorts of analyses. It gets really old really fast, and I don't think it's a good framework for us. So it's time for hunting some game theory. If you aren't familiar, there was a meme, I think, during the election where someone said something that was not related to game theory and said it was time for game theory, and it's been kind of a meme ever since. So it's actually time to debunk game theory. So question for the audience, do you believe bug-free software is a reasonable assumption? Yeah, thumbs down, correct. And do you believe wetware, like our brains, is more complex than software? Yes, okay. So traditional game theory relies on the assumption of bug-free wetware, so this is a terrible assumption. Behavioral game theory assumes there's no such thing as bug-free. So like most of you in the room, if you're kind of offensively minded, you probably agree with this assumption. Murray Gell-Mann, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, also said, think how hard physics would be if particles could think. That's why I think it's a really interesting problem area. And then Dan Gear, he was quoting someone, but he said amateurs study cryptography, professional studies economics, so that's a nice pat on the back for me. And this is what you're going to learn today. Why traditional game theory isn't even a theory and is also unfit for strategy making. A new framework that I'm proposing for modeling the InfoSec game based on behavioral-based insights. And finally, new defensive strategies that exploit either your adversary's thinking or learning, and I'll explain what both of those are. So let's go hunting to find out why. So first, what is game theory? I actually discovered this after Troopers. When I went in, I kind of assumed everyone knew what game theory was, because that's definitely the impression you get when you kind of go to conferences looking at InfoSec Twitter. Turns out nobody really knows what it is, but we like pretending like we do. So this is a refresher. You don't have to admit whether you do or don't, but I think it's helpful. So game theory is a mathematical language used to describe scenarios of conflict and cooperation. So it really is more about language than theory. It isn't actually based on fact. It's all theoretical and thinking about these imaginary games. So I use it as an engendering tool, like really something off of which to like think about other things, so you can dictate optimal strategies. So again, that's why it's a language. You can frame what a certain game or a certain conflict looks like, but it isn't the theory of the conflict itself. So game theory applies whenever actions of players are interdependent. So basically, if I make a move, like your move is going to adjust or be different depending on the move I make. So the different strategic scenarios include a bunch of different types of games, which I'm about to enumerate, as well as different solutions for each depending on the approach you have. So first, zero-sum games. So for example, in chess, there's one winner, one loser. It's pretty straightforward. In poker, the amount won by someone is equal to everyone else's losses. Non-zero-sum games. So some people think the stock market is a zero-sum game, but it's not. Like everyone can benefit. Everyone's like 401ks can increase, though there's a separate discussion about how passive investing in index funds are maybe problematic for that area. But basically, as the economy expands, like everyone can benefit. So that's why it's non-zero-sum. The prisoner's dilemma is also non-zero-sum. I'm going to dig into the prisoner's dilemma just very briefly in a bit. But it's not like one person wins, one person loses, and the like loss and gain completely cancel out. They're negative-sum games. So like nuclear war, both people do not benefit at all. Everybody is much worse off. Climate change is also kind of like a really terrible game of chicken, and everyone is worse off. But there are positive-sum games, like free trade is often thought of a positive-sum game because everybody benefits. It's not, well, current administration aside, like most people assume that like it's not a complete like 1 - 1 when you're conducting free trade. Then also equal rights. That's when everyone's better off. There's lots of empirical evidence for this too. So there are also in these games, again, thinking about game theory as a language, there are different types of information. So complete versus incomplete. Basically, you know the types of opponents you have and their motivations in complete information. Incomplete is when you don't actually know who your adversary is and what their motivations are. So in this case, you know the type of big kitties that you are facing. Perfect versus imperfect information. So perfect information is you know the moves that the other person's making. In imperfect, you don't. Then finally, information symmetry versus asymmetry. So in symmetry, each opponent has the same amount of info about the other opponent. And in asymmetry, they each have different levels of information about each other. There are also defender games, also called DAD games. And these are sequential games in which sets of players are attackers and defenders, as you might expect. The foundations are in traditional game theory. Attackers in the common theory want to be maximally harmful. A lot of times it's a terrorism use case. They're looking at what's the most amount of destruction that I can cause. They have some sort of specific goal in mind. Obviously that's not really true in this domain and many other domains, so it tends to be very narrow. And then it also assumes people are risk neutral and attackers, like I said, want to be maximally harmful. So both of those assumptions don't really hold in the real world. But the first move is defenders choose some sort of defensive investment plan. So they construct a big wall, whatever you want to think about it, but they make the first move. So then the second move is attackers observe the defensive preparations, let's say hardening infrastructure, and they choose their attack plan. So like I said, the goal they often think about is for example, there's a lot of stuff with, the Kronenberg bridges, and it's looking at how can you bomb this one bridge. But Nash equilibrium is also used to solve these games, and this is bad because the Nash equilibrium is actually pretty simplistic and not very accurate for the real world. The Nash equilibrium is looking at the optimal outcome of a non-cooperative game. So basically when you have two players trying to beat each other. It's good as a concept to analyze whatever the outcome is, but it's not very good for anything in practice. So players make the best decisions for themselves while taking their opponent's decisions still into account. So thinking about how the other player is going to play, but it's not really thinking long term either, I should clarify. So the prisoner's dilemma, the basic idea is that in an ideal world, everyone would stay silent. So it's basically you and your partner get arrested. Now the police are questioning you. You're not allowed to talk to your partner. What do? So if they both stay silent, they'll serve a really small amount of time, that -1, -1. If they both confess, it's say 2 years and 2 years. But then if one person confesses, the other refuses, whoever stayed silent actually gets 4 years in prison, which is worse. So even though the optimal outcome is that both players refuse, in practice they're probably going to confess because if you look kind of across the row, it's still more advantageous kind of as a whole for them to confess than not. So the problem with the Nash equilibrium is it's based on a priori reasoning, so it relies on theoretical deduction versus observation or experience. It also assumes rational, all-knowing players. A lot of times people don't even know the game that they're playing. I think that's true in the InfoSec game, though I try to codify what that means. Then they assume others' decisions don't affect you, but that's super unrealistic because, in my opinion, a lot of times if someone makes a certain move, it can cut off entire decision paths for you as well. But a lot of people have applied the Nash equilibrium to InfoSec over the years, particularly at the more, I will say, business-minded conferences. You'll see a lot of talks about how Nash equilibrium justifies this product or this vendor's existence, which is not very rigorous. So some of the conclusions that I was able to find just from a Google search, defenders should play extremely fast so the attacker drops out of their game. For any defenders in the room, the idea that you constantly are playing fast is just totally unrealistic. Another conclusion, which was probably my favorite, is that it's better to invest in some sort of security than not to invest, regardless of the attacker strategy. So who knew security is important? Yes?
Just would you clarify when they say should
Yeah, so the idea would be, they were very example light, but I think the idea was like, for example, if you think that an attacker's in your database, it would be like just shut down all of your network and then figure out what's going on. It's like immediately, even if you aren't sure. So, and then the other thing is like applying tons of mathematical equations to the problem, which no defender's ever gonna do. So, so a new defensive framework. The idea here is that now that we know game theory is a language used to describe some sort of game or conflict, it's not just a theory. We need to explore like what sort of framework does work, what sort of theory does work, and I'm going to be leveraging behavioral insights. So using game theory for its expressive power, I think is really important. So it's also important to look at data outside of game theory. So again, looking at kind of cross-domain analysis, like what insights can be gleaned from other domains when they've been researching this sort of stuff. But first, I think it's important to figure out what game is InfoSec. I argue it is a DAD game, so it's continuous defense and attack. It's non-zero sum. I think sometimes people think of InfoSec as zero sum, but I really don't think so, particularly in the case of like nation-state espionage. Realistically, it's probably not going to affect your day-to-day operations very much. It probably won't affect your stock price. I mean, maybe if you reach, but like Equifax is the first time it really affected the stock price of a company. So it remains to be seen if that's kind of its own unique case. But like in Target's case, it affected their earnings, I think, 1 quarter, but not very much beyond that. Then I think there's incomplete, imperfect, and asymmetrical information. I don't think we know nearly enough about our opponents. We can't track their moves. We don't even know most of the time like what type of attacker is, and we certainly have asymmetrical information. It's also sequential and dynamic, so it's not just like one round and then you're done. It's a kind of ongoing process. I also think it's a uniquely potentially tricky game. The closest is like a peace war game in the sense of nuclear conflict, but don't compare it to nuclear conflicts, it's completely different. But it's similar as far as the opacity of information and that it's sequential. So another question, have you heard InfoSec described as a cat and mouse game? Yes. Fun fact, until last week, I had never really thought about what this meant, and I always assumed that the defender was the mouse, but it's obviously the cat who was never actually able to catch the mouse. So that was my mea culpa, but I know now. But the problem is traditional game theory doesn't actually allow for those or most characteristics of the InfoSec game because it assumes people are rational, and they aren't. It assumes static versus dynamic environments. So again, if you have kind of like, if you think about the cat and the mouse, they're always chasing each other. Traditional game theory doesn't assume that. And also the fact that you can't ever be one step ahead of your adversary. I think a lot of people recognize that a lot of times attackers are one step ahead of defenders, but traditional game theory doesn't allow for that. Then also just empirically speaking, deviations from the Nash equilibrium are everywhere, but the problem is traditional DAD games extrapolate from Nash equilibrium, making it hard to model this. So the first time that behavioral insights from a DAD game or like a behavioral econ study studying DAD games came out was in March, and there hasn't really been much since then, so I think it's going to be something hopefully we see more of over the next few years. Even John Nash said this, I feel personally that the study of experimental games is the proper route of travel for finding the ultimate truth in relation to games as played by human players. So I think if he even understood it, I think it's important to think about. So the behavior-based framework. So I think it needs to be experimental. How do people actually behave? And then it's also good to think about the fact that people, just the way our brains work, we predict our opponent's moves by either thinking or learning, which I'm about to explain. So thinking is just modeling how opponents are likely to respond. So this is before you've made a move, it's thinking about what they're going to do. Our brains work like volatile memory. So it's kind of like DRAM, which needs constant refresh cycles and is not very efficient. So working memory is a hard constraint for human brains. It's very hard for us to have a large number of like higher order beliefs maintained. So thinking about, say, 10 steps in the future, just as far as we're thinking about it and not writing down, it's very difficult for us to do. So a lot of times we only think about what's the immediate kind of step ahead. And then humans kind of suck at recursion. So basically increasing the number of steps really strains our working memory, so it makes it really difficult to process them. Learning, however, is predicting how opponents will behave based on their behavior in prior games or rounds. So this takes over once you have prior experience to leverage. Humans tend to learn through error reinforcement learning, which just means trial and error learning. And then people have learning rates, so basically how much experiences factor into decision making. There's also a very, very small random variable there, which is much smaller than people think. A lot of it is kind of like the past experience that we have, but there's enough that clearly for our lizard brains, they wanted us to keep trying something a little bit new, so it's a very small factor there. Then something I find cool, which is not going to be explored at all in this talk, I hate to disappoint you, is that dopamine neurons encode errors. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to think about as far as the neuroeconomics of attackers and defenders, but I don't have the money for like an MRI machine, so if someone does have the money, please give it to me and I'll start to do cool studies. But until then, no dice. So as a case study, there's a study by Wexler and Buchler, which basically, not in InfoSec, but looked at 200 consecutive security games in the traditional kind of physical security context across 4 different strategies. The idea was that you have different learning rates for attackers, again, how much they learn from prior experience, and they tested the number of prevented attacks for each strategy. So basically, there was a 4x4 payoff matrix across those 4 strategies. They were just going to examine the number of prevented attacks based on that matrix. So what they found was a fixed strategy prevented attacks 10 to 25% of the time, which is like really, really terrible. A game theory strategy prevented them about half the time. A random strategy also prevented them about half the time. Then the cognitive modeling strategy, which again is thinking about like what was the prior behavior of your opponent, prevented 61 to 77%, which in numeric terms, 22 to 54 more attacks out of the 200. So that takes into account the fact that, again, attackers will favor certain options or avoid certain options depending on whether their actions failed or succeeded in the past. There's a paper I have in my references called Know Your Enemy. You can see that as a reference. So what it means is attackers aren't completely unpredictable. They're also not, like, I guess, normative decision makers. Sorry.
Question, in all the variables when it comes to the behavioral analysis, is one of the data points whether or not the attackers or defenders are being observed at the time? And when I say being observed, I mean, if you're doing like a red versus blue exercise, do the blue teams know that they're being observed while defending versus they're within their native environment, it's a day-to-day business, and all of a sudden there's a undisclosed red team operation or pen test occurring in their environment, and they would act differently. I don't know if that's some data point.
It's not been nearly studied. Like I said, there's been no study of behavioral economics for InfoSec as far as an academic study. So no, nothing's gone into that level. I appreciate the questions. I do. There's a lot of material, so I will try to pause for questions, but I'm also very aware of the fact that this is a very 50 to 55 minute talk. So yep. But in general, there's not enough data like in InfoSec at all, I think, for behavioral related stuff. The point to that to me is don't be replaced by a random security strategy algorithm. If game theory is just as good as random, you might as well kind of do whatever and see if it works. So the implementation. So a lot of this is nice in theory, but how do you actually do this on a practical level? So I'm going to walk you through 5 parts. The first is a SWOT analysis, which you've seen Silicon Valley. I sometimes like to think of myself as the Jared of InfoSec, kind of doing the boring things, but I get really excited about it. So we're going to do a SWOT analysis as well as a perceptual SWOT analysis, which is super fancy. Then going through thinking exploitation and learning exploitation. Then the concept of minimax, and then finally looking ahead for what would be awesome to do in the future. So a SWOT analysis. The 101 of a traditional SWOT. So it was developed by Harvard Business School in the 1960s. It's a super common in business strategy in general. So it looks at the objective of an organization or project to see what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Strengths and weaknesses are all internally based. So what are the internal factors that make up your strengths and weaknesses? Opportunities and threats are taking in mind the external context to see again, what are the opportunities you can pursue and what are the external threats to whatever you're working on. So I think you need to model a SWOT for yourself in relation to your adversary, but also do the reverse, the adversary in relation to you. Again, trying to really think about how your opponent is thinking. So a fantastic game theory professor at NYU named Adam Brandenburger, with whom I had the pleasure of speaking, One of his quotes is, "The primary insight of game theory is the importance of focusing on others, of putting yourself into the shoes of other players and trying to play out all the reactions as far ahead as possible." And in the vein of Toby's talk, like, if you can play devil's advocate, that's exactly what you need to be doing in this case. So this is just a very kind of high-level example SWOT for kind of like a traditional defender. Some of the strengths, basically you have an understanding of the target environment, hopefully, because it's your environment. You have a motivation not to be breached. I think that's definitely a given. The weaknesses are you may have inadequate budget. That's kind of changing given the level of board focus, but I think budget problems are something most people have experienced. A lack of personnel, I think everyone's familiar with. There aren't enough people to hire in InfoSec. Then finally, limited employee training, thinking about, employees click on phishing links, whatever else, they aren't learning properly. That sort of thing is kind of an internal weakness. The opportunities are leveraging things like containers to allow for easy tear up and tear down. I just gave a talk about resilience, which talks a little bit more about that, so I encourage you to check that out if you want to learn more about that sort of stuff. And then, as I mentioned, there's increased board attention to get more budget. The threats, though, are attackers can also use new tech for scalability. Like, I know a lot of what we've been seeing is they're using like Google services, Amazon, obviously stuff like that, even Dropbox as far as like new ways to deliver attacks, which is bad. It's also really hard to keep up with the pace of new attack surface. It's hard enough to kind of have asset management, and then as you get more devices, more software, whatever else, it makes it really difficult. So perceptual SWOT, this was developed by the same NYU professor. So the idea for perceptual SWOT is that things like core competencies can actually be weaknesses. Weaknesses can be strengths. So if you're familiar with judo, it's sometimes called the judo strategy. So basically, like, how do you use your opponent's weight against them? So thinking about yourself versus the other, what are the perceptual SWOTs? So you need to think about, what do you think is a strength? What's your perception of a strength? How is that actually a weakness? And then that's going to be the reality. And then, like, what weakness is actually a strength? For your opponent, obviously what the opponent thinks or what you think is their strength could actually be a weakness, and that presents an opportunity. And then what you think is a weakness or they think is a weakness is actually a strength of theirs. The idea here is, so Andrew Grove, actually the former CEO of Intel, said that, for example, the biggest core rigidity is actually top management. Management went through prior conditions to get to that point, and they don't exactly understand kind of the new realities and the new challenges that are being faced. So basically, the moment that the environment changes, the people at the top are the wrong people to be there. So what you think is a strength is actually a weakness. So I think things like compliance and fixed security guidelines can sometimes be seen as a strength to at least get a bare minimum, but it's also a rigidity, right? And then moving on to attackers, I think a good example is an attacker strength is having the time to craft an attack. So like Micah's talk earlier, like, a lot of it is about patience. Problem is you can also leverage that strength with strategies that lead attackers down rabbit holes and waste their time. Another one is having access to known vulnerabilities. So the idea is you can confuse them with fake architecture or fake-looking systems so they can't be certain what you're actually running. So thinking exploitation. So my talk at Zero Nights is mostly going to be about these sorts of tips and tricks, like how defenders can also exploit things, particularly their attackers' way of thinking through problems. So this is part of that. So belief prompting, the idea is that you just increase the player's thinking by one step. It's part of the idea of, as I said before, like, you can only have so many steps in your head, so this is how can you improve that. So what you do is you prompt the player to consider, like, how their opponents, who their opponents are, and how their opponents will react over time. And I think for security, you have to model assumptions around, like, capital, time, tools, risk aversion. Again, as Toby said, like, you need to think about, like, is there a specific sort of adversary you're looking to emulate and think about? You can't just think about kind of a generic attacker without having kind of like something specific to test in mind. I take this idea further, which is that you should model out entire decision trees, which I'm going to talk about shortly. In general, there's been a lot of research to show, for example, I think it was that if if someone's trying to predict their opponent, they'll get it, say, right 30% of the time, traditionally speaking, 70% of the time it's wrong. But if you have them perform some sort of belief prompting, that actually switches and they get it right 70% of the time. So there's good empirical evidence for this. So your goal is to ask, if I do something in X, how will that change my opponent's strategy? How are they going to react? So a generic belief prompting guide. How would attackers preemptively bypass whatever defensive move I make? So if I implement two-factor authentication, what will they do instead? What will the opponent do next in response? What are the costs of the opponent's offensive move? Like something super fancy, probably they're not going to do. They're going to try something simpler like phishing at first. Then also what's the probability the opponent will conduct the move, which also can be based on things like cost or time. I think additional things, obviously, how do you think our adversary chooses their delivery method? Obviously, what assets are they going to go after? What countermeasures will they think that we have? And then, as an example, let's say a script kiddie lands on one of our servers. What are they going to do next? Let's say they perform local reconnaissance. They escalate to whatever privileges they can get. The counter would be something like privilege separation and don't hard-code credentials, which we've seen recently people still definitely do. This leads to the attacker has to exploit the server, and there's a risk that the server crashes, so you're slowly raising the cost of the attacker that way and thinking through everything that they're going to do. So with decision tree modeling, which is attempting to codify that whole process. So they're just representations of sequential games, in essence, which I think is better than the payoff matrices that show kind of a static point in time. So what you want to do is model these decision trees that include both offense and defense, and I'll show you a visualization of them so it's not too conceptual. You also want to theorize the probabilities of each branch, which I think first you want to use kind of like fuzzy estimates, which I think is totally fine. You can refine those over time based on whatever data you see or other hunches you have. And I think one of the big benefits, which I'll reemphasize in a bit, is that it creates tangible metrics to deter self-justification. So again, back to Toby's talk, you don't want to have that kind of like circular thinking, that hive mind thinking. So if you put, here were our assumptions, you can then go back and be like, look, we were wrong here, and you can start to think through what do we need to do instead. A quote that I've used in a lot of my presentations is by Dino Daizovi, who's great. I definitely recommend you read the attacker math presentation he put together. But he said attackers will take the least cost path through an attack graph from their start node to their gold node. Obviously, attackers have a minimization function, and that's on cost. So for the decision tree, which I don't have my little laser pointer, full admission, I use that mostly as a toy for my cat, and so it's currently in the like cat toy area of my apartment, so I completely forgot it, which is bad. But anyway, so you have this kind of like, you start at a reality. This is the reality of your world. You have, say, a 25% probability that skiddies or someone random, let's say hacktivists, that's not in vogue anymore, apparently, it's 25% of the time. The nation state, I think this is probably high for most organizations, is 10% of the time. And then 65% of the time, it's going to be some sort of criminal group. The idea here, how far does this extend? Okay, this doesn't extend very far, so I apologize. But as you can see here, the first step, remember in a dad game, is you have some sort of defensive investment plan. So let's say you invested in YOLO, which is doing nothing. I definitely don't recommend YOLO security, but lots of people do it. So let's say you YOLO'd, you don't have any privilege separation. Obviously, the attacker's next move is like, okay, well, we have root. This is great. These people are idiots. So let's say the next move you make is also YOLO, and you don't have any role separation. They're like, okay, there's a database on the box. Let me use it. And then you continue to YOLO, and you don't have any tokenization or segmentation of, let's say, these are like creds they want to get on the box. That means they win. They get to their target. In contrast, what you want to do is think, okay, let's say implement privilege separation. Let's say it works, I don't know, 60% of the time. What you'll then see is as a counter, the attacker either has to scan for whatever reachable data they can get from their current privileges, or they use some sort of, let's say, known exploit, which say works 50% of the time. Then what you can say is, okay, if we know they're going to do that, then we'll implement something like grsec, which is, as someone said, like grsec makes it so unusable for the actual user, it makes it impossible for an attacker as well. So let's say it works like 98% of the time. So the other option is you can use something like seccomp. That works, say, 50% of the time. If you do that route, let's say they use a 1 day, which is like not super fresh O day, and that works, let's say, 10% of the time, or they use it 10% of the time. And then they can also have O day, and that gets them to a win. With grsec, they have what I call elite O day, because it's generally you get extra props if you have something that also works with grsec. And that's, say, like, they'll use that 2% of the time. So the whole idea with this here, and I'm happy to answer questions about this at the end, is really thinking about how can you force the attacker to that very far, it can be right or left, depending on how you go. Like, how can we force them to have to use elite O day? So to me, when I think about how do you create a decision tree, I've actually done this for consulting a few times, and it seems to work pretty well, is first thinking about what assets do our attackers actually want. It's also thinking about like what what assets do we care, but it's really like what will the attacker try to get? And the important clarification there is also maybe attackers want some sort of asset you have and you don't really care if they take it. That's valid. It's part of your own threat model and like building in or drawing in business context, but you need to be aware of what that is. The second thing, what's the easiest way for attackers to get those assets? Obviously the YOLO branch, that's like a very easy way. Then what countermeasures are on that path? Think about what like defensive procedures you currently have. Do you have privilege separation? Do you have like IDS, anything like that? Then what new path will the attacker take given that mitigation? So if you have IDS, what are they going to do instead? And create a new branch for that. My idea is you repeat 1 through 4 until you create that path where they, as I put it, have to use O day all the way down. Like again, force them to use that elite O day. Like what does that path look like? What are the mitigations on that path? Then you assign very, very rough probabilities so you can kind of think about what's realistic. I've gotten questions before like, how do you draw this out? So I use PowerPoint. It's very inefficient, but obviously good if you're presenting in PowerPoint. But you can use whiteboards and then camera snaps, write a huge do not erase. Draw.io and Glyphy have plugs into Confluence, which can be useful if you're a Jira or like Atlassian shop. There's Google Docs. They allow for like insert drawing. So if you're using a lot of like Google Slides, Google Docs, that's useful. And then Visio, I hate Visio. Apparently, I learned after presenting this at Black Hat, some people actually like Visio. That was shocking, but you can also use Visio. But I really think strongly that decision trees help create a feedback loop to refine strategy. Like again, it's thinking through your assumptions, thinking through how you're thinking about attackers, and allowing you to go back and check those assumptions as you get new data as the reality changes. So in particular, it helps for auditing after some sort of incident. So you can think about, okay, where did our thinking actually go wrong? Like what mitigations did we have? What did we overlook? It also helps ensure, I think a big problem in InfoSec and technology in general is that we take additive-only approaches and we don't really revisit what do we currently have. Like there are countless times I've heard of people saying like, yeah, apparently we're using some technology from say 2006, but we never thought to get rid of it and you're still even maybe paying for it. But it helps ensure that you've actually mapped that out. It also helps if there's like, again, as I said, a historical record of your decision-making process, which is super important. I think I have another talk where I talk about like how to make decisions in groups. I think it's also really important from a group decision-making perspective that this is kind of like an objective, collaborative thing, rather than like, oh, well, it was my assumption that whatever, you can't point fingers as much. It's like, no, we agreed that this is kind of like our threat model, this was our decision tree, and it makes it more neutral. It also mitigates, I think, the doubling down effect, where it's like, okay, well, we had whatever sort of strategy, like with Equifax, let's say this was obviously not true, but obviously FireEye, I believe they were a testimonial for FireEye, so it's like, okay, well, if we just had FireEye, maybe that wasn't the best strategy, and it helps to show we thought that would mitigate whatever was going to happen. Obviously, it didn't, so let's rethink what the branches actually are and what countermeasures we can put in place instead. The big idea is the defender's advantage is you know the home turf. I realize that's not always true, even for Fortune 500s, but that should be the strength which you try to leverage. So again, you want to visualize the hardest path for attackers, and how can you force them onto that path, leveraging the fact that you understand your own environment. Then looking at the commonalities on trees, like during some of the exercises I've done, things like two-factor will come up on almost every tree. Like it's almost always, it's useful somewhere. So it's thinking about like how can you get the most ROI for whatever security product you're using by cutting off the most attack paths possible. So another idea is with these decision trees, is make them the new quote-unquote nice report. So it's a new request if you do outsource penetration testing, which I believe Toby and Dade said probably not to do. You can ask them to do it. If you have a red team, I think it's very valuable to then ask them, like, not just how did you get to whatever the goal was, it's also what did you do that didn't work? What did you encounter? Like what countermeasure actually worked? What were the rabbit holes you went down that didn't pan out? Because maybe there's something that you don't even realize is working, and if they can articulate that, that's great. It helps you, again, to see that sort of attacker perspective or alternative perspective of your defenses and where to improve. So learning exploitation. Again, that was about thinking exploitation, which is before you've actually had prior experiences with your opponent. This is has two specific types of exploitation, I would say. So there's information asymmetry exploitation, which is disrupting the attacker learning process. So attackers learn just like everyone else. They factor past experiences into their model. How can you make that process not work? Then there's learning rate exploitation, which is basically you can make those past experiences unreliable and play on the fact that they have that learning rate into how they learn, and introduce unreliability into that data and start to actually preempt their moves, which is more of the long-term thing. But what you're trying to do really is make sure that their model is inaccurate. So again, exploit the fact that you understand the local environment better than attackers. One way is through falsifying data. When we think of asymmetry in InfoSec, I think we often think of the fact that attackers know way more about us than vice versa. But I think there's actually a chance to reverse that. So there's been some research that looked into jammers and I think it's, energy harvesting communication systems, which is not obviously the InfoSec domain. But what they found is attackers are really, really reliant in that case on the disclosed power level of the device in order to actually jam it. So what you can do is actually start falsifying that level of power and the attackers can actually conduct their attack appropriately. So the idea of leveraging that, the Macron campaign is a case study, and keep in mind, I don't think we ever got confirmation that they actually did this, but they said they did, so let's assume that they did. They allegedly used phishing tar pitting. So they, when they signed on to phishing pages, they used true and false logins and passwords. They also planted fake documents, like I think one was, they had like a Silk Road order, which was very obviously bogus. They also used fake languages in their documents, like Cyrillic, just to make it very hard to verify everything. Really, this plays into the Twitter phenomenon of last year, which was Waste His Time 2016, but it's for hackers. So if you weren't aware of this, the idea was that, if let's say like a guy is not texting you back or he's stringing you along, something like that, you waste his time. You have him spend buy you a dinner or something else, or just in general different strategies to waste his time similarly to how he was wasting yours. The idea here is doing that for attackers. The goal is to really throw a wrench into the attacker's scientific method so they can't test their hypotheses. So the goal really is to make it so the attacker doesn't know why they're failing and have them keep expending resources to find out. So some of the things here, attackers probing the system, you can create custom email rejection messages. And then what you can do is create a honeydoc on, let's say, the Avaloq policy, and you post that somewhere. So when they Google that and they hit that honeydoc, you can be like, okay, someone's actually probing the system. They clearly got that error message. We know that we should be a little more careful or be watching out for that. Yeah, and basically for any of these, you want to track when it was accessed. The idea also is long term. If you use these honey documents, honey tokens, like thanks canaries, that look to describe legitimate policies or technologies that would be useful in attacker recon, and particularly if you can have it kind of go through the different steps an attacker would need to conduct, you can start understanding kind of like the timing and pacing of your attackers. Non-determinism is another aspect of this. So non-determinism basically means like there are different behaviors at different times and you can't expect the same results every time. ASLR is a non-deterministic feature. It's one of the more, I would say, famous ones in securities, but it's also highly deterministic in that it works the same way every time. But I want to amplify that and extend it to kind of a higher level in thinking about security. So the goal here is to screw up attacker profiling. So you want to raise the cost of attack at the very first step, which is recon. So you make the attacker uncertain of your defensive profile and your environment. As an example, a lot of malware is now designed to look to see if they're in a VM or like a malware analyst sandbox, and it won't run because it doesn't want to be caught. So a good strategy is to make everything look like a malware analyst sandbox because then it will never run. A better strategy is make it look like a different malware analyst sandbox every time. So you can only afford so many like $250,000 appliances, so it's a lot easier some way if you put wolf skins on the sheep, as I put it. The idea is you mix and match hollow, like a very superficial, meaning that it's not actually the program, but it's just artifacts of the program, but like sketchy looking from the perspective of the attacker, the malware, artifacts on like a normal physical system. So think about your typical employees. There aren't too many tools around this, but this is one of them. And it really just helps you emulate virtual artifacts onto physical machines. The Unprotect project also has kind of lists of what those virtual artifacts are, specifically what malware is looking for most commonly. This is also a list. So you can add in things like Wireshark, Fiddler, but these are a bunch of executables that have been found, it's been found malware is looking for, like VMware, all that stuff. You can also, those are like typical MAC address prefixes, so you can change that. You can just create like different DLLs. You can also, more stuff that you can create. You can create like fake drives, stuff like that. And again, the idea is that you mix and match these just to make it really, really confusing. Because then if attackers like, okay, why isn't this running? Like, why are we not able to do this across like all of these systems? It's gonna be really hard to figure out like what the machines actually are. Debuggers are also an example of something that you can emulate. So they register like certain driver objects, so you can pretend that you have those. And they, it's pretty nice in that a lot of times when you're looking at the reverse, like malware, like people writing malware that are like, okay, how can we look to see a debugger? They'll find, oh yeah, it's always, a function of it's a 1 or a 0 as far as like what the structure is set to. And so that means you can be extra reliable on the other side and just always have it be a 1 rather than a 0. So it makes it pretty simple. You can also load DLLs from AV engines and make it look like you have either like all antivirus or a bunch of different types, which can also be confusing. It's pretty easy to find these, but these are some of the most common kind of like endpoint protection agents or AV agents that I was able to find. The idea here is you could have a forwarder DLL. So basically you have one DLL which loads a bunch of different other ones. And again, you can maybe choose at random. You can also deploy like the lightest weight hypervisor you have, because malware also looks for that. I haven't used any of these, but these all seem to be pretty good. But this is just like added wolf skin. Then Minimax. You may have heard it also as MaxiMin. It's by John von Neumann, who's like a notable polymath. Basically, he assumed that each player chooses their strategy in a position of complete ignorance concerning like the other player's choices, and so the other player has to choose safely. The idea is you minimize the possible loss for a worst case maximum loss scenario. So you want to minimize given like you're assuming complete catastrophe. So Dan Geer had a paper that actually looked at this for calculating risk via evolutionary risk management functions, which partly inspired my resilience talk on Thursday. And it examines minimax functions. So you want to find the minimum of the sum of the expected cost of protection and the expected cost of non-protection. So basically, if you have like a a cost curve for like the expected cost of non-protection and then expected cost of protection, they're going to be slightly different. So it's like the cost of a breach versus the cost of the security products on which you're spending money. And some of the conclusions from here, Dan Geer cited that one idea is you don't have a monoculture. I talk about this idea of diversity a bit more in the talk from 2 days ago. It's on my Twitter if you want to see. It's very beneficial for protection. There is a trade-off with efficiency here, and I think that's very much so up for debate. It's not the context of this talk. Stochastic decisions or random decisions can be better than deterministic ones. Again, as we saw, they're at least equally as good as game theory, and it can be helpful to throw off attackers. Then from the imitation game, the idea would be, so in the imitation game, basically you have the Enigma machine. You can like figure out what the Germans are doing, but you don't want to act on that information all the time because they'll figure out the fact that you're obviously having access to that sort of information. You also you don't want to use it none of the time because you want to have some sort of advantage. So it's like, what's the balance between using it some of the time, less of the time? And they talk about that in the imitation game. And finally, looking ahead. So this is kind of thinking about how to use these sorts of behavioral strategies, this framework going forward. Fluctuating infrastructure using emerging tech, which I don't think it's been solidified yet, but seems to be called infrastructure 3.0, like containers is one way. Netflix's Chaos Monkey, another thing I talked about in that other talk, makes it really difficult for attackers to persist. So the idea with Chaos Monkey is basically it kills instances at random. So you basically have a lot of like tearing up and down. Again, it makes it very hard for persistence, which is great as far as defending against attackers. This notion of fluctuating infrastructure, you never have the same sort of environment at any one time. So again, it really, really hurts attacker profiling. I think the dream is modeling attacker cognition versus model tracing, like really getting towards predicting attacker actions. I don't think we're anywhere close to there. We have to start being able to collect the data. So I think Thinkst, for example, makes these canary tokens. You can actually create your own. I have a bunch. They're super useful. But it helps in the prior example of, again, like you have some sort of honey tokens to try to figure out, okay, what reconnaissance activities is an attacker conducting? You can start to model out kind of like the process that they're going through, again, the timing and so forth. The idea is also, again, that preferences change based on experience. So what you can do is sometimes like not block a certain attacker action and see, do they perform that action again? So you want to incorporate what's called the post-decision state, which is like the attacker has either received like a success or fail feedback. You want to figure out how they're going to respond to that. Also, the higher the attacker's learning rate, it's easier to predict their decisions. Generally, the learning rate is slightly variable between people, so it's good to figure out and start to calculate how much those sorts of prior decisions will factor into their decision making. You also don't have to assume like initial attacker preferences based on empirical research. So in that prior example with the random equals game theory result, I think it was initial preferences only changed the outcomes by 1% or something, so it's pretty much negligible. So the brief formula here is basically the change in the expected utility of an offensive action, basically like how much an attacker wants to use a specific action. It's basically the learning rate times the feedback, like a success or failure, minus the current expected utility. So basically it'll change based on whatever the attacker's learning rate is, how much they incorporate prior experience into their model, times like success minus like how much they already wanted to perform that action. So for example, if the learning rate is 20%, which is roughly reasonable, and then you just make like a success 1 and then a loss -1, then if an attacker successfully performs an action, the learning rate is 20%, it means that the attacker is 20% more likely to do whatever the action is going forward. Then from here, based on what you actually see, like how likely they are to continue performing certain actions over time, you can start to adjust that learning rate, start to predict. So the tricky part here is that they may respond more to losses than to gains. I talk about prospect theory, one of my other talks. There hasn't been a lot of work on that yet, and I think we're so far away from this point right now, we don't have to worry about it. But it would be great to get to the point where we do have to worry about it. So yeah, you basically want to track the utility values for each attacker action. And then for detected or blocked actions, the attacker action and outcome are known variables, so the utility is calculable. Obviously, if you aren't aware an attacker is conducting an action, you can't get to that point. But at least then you can kind of start predicting if you're able to actually see an attacker's actively conducting some sort of campaign. Hopefully you can start to predict what they're going to do, particularly if you start to see commonalities between actions of compromises in the past versus the current one. That would be super helpful. So in conclusion, despite the meme, it's no longer time for some game theory. We've also learned that game theory is a language, not even a theory. So to me, now you can sound extra pretentious at cocktail parties by saying that. So if that's the one thing you take away, that's fine with me. So you start with a SWOT analysis to gain perspective of yourself in the context of your adversary and vice versa. You use thinking exploitation to improve your threat modeling. And you use learning exploitation to beleaguer your adversaries by messing with their ability to profile. I think this is a collaborative effort, so we have to work together to build strategies based on this behavioral framework. I know that generally collaboration across the industry hasn't necessarily worked well, but I think this is such a new area that I think being able, like even since I gave the talk at Black Hat, like hearing people's strategies that they've already been testing in their own organization, I think starting to talk to each other about how can we leverage these ideas is really, really important. Then the next step is how to begin model tracing attackers. Again, the idea of the honey tokens, tracking what their actions are, that's super useful. Then finally, hopefully we can start to predict attacker behavior. So I recommend try these at home, make your blue team empirical. Like honestly, the worst case is like random is just as good as game theory. You're probably doing something maybe based on game theory because a lot of strategy is, so you might as well give it a shot. And the quote I always like to close on is Dan Geer's, which is good enough is good enough. Good enough always beats perfect. The hard part is obviously determining what's good enough. His goal was like self-sufficiency, not expertness, and having a culture of measurement. But the idea is even if however you implement it isn't perfect, it's probably going to be better than what you're doing. So take the risk and try. So slides from Black Hat are already online. I'll also post these again. So you don't necessarily have to take a picture now. This is my various contact information. With that, thanks very much.